Hi, everyone. Welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain. And today we're going to talk about three halachic bases for minority rights in Israel, democratic minority rights in the modern state of Israel. Why are we doing this? Because we are learning in the daf this week about the isur, the prohibition of lo techonim. You should not give them grace, which the Gemara interprets as lo titen lahem chanaya bakarka. You cannot give them, and the assumption is that the them is pagans. You cannot give pagans a hold on the land. You can't sell them land in Israel. Now, when you look at Masechet Avodah Zarah in general, what you're seeing is an attempt to figure out halachically how to engage with the non-Jewish world around them. And the question really becomes, as the world changes, both we, the Jewish people, change, and the nations of the world change, how do some of these negotiations change? And so I decided it would be really interesting to see what three contemporary 20th century religious Zionist rabbis had to say, not just about lo techonim, not just about not being able to give them lands, because to be honest, that's kind of easily solved, right? Essentially, what you have to do is prove that they're not pagans. And that's not hard to do with Islam, and it's not hard to do with Christianity either, because even if that's Avodah Zarah for us, it's only what we call shituf for them. So it's not so hard to get over that hump. But I actually think what's more interesting is actually the whole way of thinking regarding non-Jewish minorities in Israel and what kind of religious basis that could have. So today I'm going to give you three different approaches to that. One is from Rav Yitzchak Isaac Halevi Herzog. And yes, we are talking about Bougie's grandfather. And that is from the eve of the founding of the state. Another is from Rav Chaim David Halevi, who was the chief rabbi of, oh, I should say Rav Herzog was the chief rabbi of Israel, Ashkenazic chief rabbi of Israel. And another from Rav Chaim David Halevi, who was chief rabbi of Tel Aviv in the late 20th century. And another is from Rav Yehuda Amital, who was co-Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Har Etzion. Each one of them offers a different explanation for the basis of minority rights in Israel. And I think it's really fascinating to see what they say. So without further ado, let's take a look. I included for you on the source sheet, of course, the pasuk in the Torah from which lo techonim comes, and the Gemara in Avodah Zarah that it describes it as lo titen lahem chanaya bakarka. You shouldn't give pagans a hold in the land. But really, I want to spend the most time on these three approaches. So the first is Rav Yitzchak Isaac Halevi Herzog. What's interesting about Herzog is that he wanted the state of Israel to be a theocracy, but he wanted it to be a theocracy that could also be a democracy. So he spent a long time trying to figure out how he could come up with halakhic interpretations that would allow Israel to be a democratic state without violating halakha. And when he talks about why he's doing this in his Tchukat L'Yisrael Al Pi Torah, which is a 3 volume that I highly recommend people check out, he actually talks about his reluctance, essentially. He talks about the idea that actually we are stuck under the thumb of the non-Jewish world, and that's why we need Israel to be a democracy. So I think this is fascinating. You sort of feel him in 1947, very dependent on the UN. So he says as follows, ועתה הגיע הזמן להסתכל במצב כמו שהוא ממש, ולבחון את ההלכה מתוך אותו הסתכלות הריאלית. He's like, we got to be realistic about where we are. אנחנו לא כבשנו עד עכשיו, ולא יכולנו לכבוש את הארץ כנגד רצונם של האומות המאוחדות. We have not gotten the land, we have not conquered the land, and we would not be able to conquer the land without the gushvanka of the UN, right? How times have changed, right? Al pi haskamatam, based on their agreement, ואין שום ספק שעד שיבוא משיח צדקנו נצטרך להגנתם עלינו, and there's no question that until Mashiach comes, we are going to need their help defending us, כנגד ים של אויבים מדיניים מקיפים מסביב, against a sea of national enemies who are all around us, she'adam tagia gam letoch hamedina, that also penetrate within the state of Israel. וגם אין שום ספק שלא ייתנו לנו את המדינה היהודית, אלא אם כן נקבע בתחוקה ובמשפט זכות המיעוטים לסבילות הנידונת. And there's no question that they're not going to let us have our own state unless we put into our constitution, into our law, the rights of minorities to have tolerance, to have proper, to be tolerated. And I don't mean tolerated in a negative way. I mean tolerance in the sense of democratic rights. וודאי שמניעת אפליות וקיפוחים של מוסלמים ונוצרים גם יחד תהווה אלמנט יסודי מתוך הזכות למדינה שייתנו לנו. And certainly not discriminating against Muslims and Christians is going to have to be a foundational element within our ability to get this state. What should we do? Should we say to the nations, sorry, we can't accept this condition? Because our holy Torah prohibits a Jewish government from allowing Christians, and all the more so actual pagans, to live in our nation, to live on our land. And it also prohibits us from allowing their worship, the Christian worship, and kal v'chomer, pagan worship. ואוסרת עלינו להרשות להם לרכוש, I think, karkaot, and it also doesn't allow us to let them gain land to gain land in Israel. Domani, I think, or domani, shelo yetze rav b'Yisrael bal moach ubal seichel yashar. There's no common sense rabbi in the Jewish people who will think that this is what we have to answer. Sorry, it goes against our Torah. We're not allowed to have equal rights because then we're not going to be able to get our state. Right? Nobody's going to say, oh, sorry, our Torah doesn't allow this. Okay? Then he continues. He's not done. You can see he's reluctant. But he thinks we need it in order to be able to get our state. Now, I want to just say, we need it in order to be able to get our state. He actually speaks about this as it has to be that yadenu tkefa. It has to be that our hand, that we actually have the upper hand in order for these things to even apply, these kinds of things, lo techonem and things like that. But we don't, our hand, it's not the upper hand, even if we are a sovereign state, because we are beholden to the we are beholden to the UN, right? So he goes on and he says, afilu im naniach שבקבלנו את המדינה בתנאי הנ"ל, תעבור ממשלה יהודית עבירה כשתקיים את התנאי, even if you think we would actually be doing a sin to accept this condition, גם אז הייתי אומר שהעבירה נדחית מפני פיקוח נפש של עם ישראל. I would say, well, you know what, for pikuach nefesh, saving the Jewish people is worth it. And then he goes on to say, even though Avodah Zarah is not allowed for saving yourself, it's one of the big three cardinal sins that you should die rather than be saved. We're not doing any Avodah Zarah ourselves. We are just allowing other people to do their worship. Okay, so he goes on. It's worth reading on your own time. See the whole thing. I really tried to include as much as I could here. But I also want to add, I want to make sure that we read a few of the pieces at the end where, you see a little bit more coming through. It says, "Mitzvot halalu shehin mitzvot tziboriot." These mitzvot of, not allowing foreign worship in Israel, not giving land to pagans. These mitzvot are communal mitzvot. Hamutalot lo al kol yachid v'yachid el al haguf hashalit. These are incumbent not upon individuals, but incumbent upon the ruling body. Ala memshala yehudit be'ezet tzura shetehei, on the Jewish government, whatever that government is. He's thinking, is it a monarchy? And here, it's a democracy. Shakoach biyada lekaiman. If it has the strength, meaning it has the power to actually uphold these things. Lo hutalu lechatchila ela al ha'am ha'yehudi hakovesh ha'aretz v'hamekabel et ha'sovreniut me'atzmo. They were actually, these isurim, these prohibitions were actually for a Jewish nation that conquers the land and gets sovereignty on its own, without having to take into account what the non-Jewish nations are going to require. Harezeu hareka b'Torah shel otana mitzvot. That's the background of these mitzvot in the Torah. Upashtut ha'inyan me'ida al atzma. And it's so clear. You can see it on its own. Im kain, therefore, if so, excuse me, efo, however, behadro shel rekazeh, if there isn't this background, uvitzna'ei mitziut or vitznai mitziut kazo shamedina nitanet al menat kach, and in a condition such as this, that we only get the state on condition of doing this, ein chalot lo'otana mitzvot, kimo she'ein chalot lo'otana mitzvot bagola. There is no application of those mitzvot. They don't apply. They simply don't apply. They don't apply the same way they don't apply when we are in exile. And just like they wouldn't apply if there wasn't a Jewish government. Okay? It's a little bit more that he says, just to remind us that actually Christianity and Islam are not Avodah Zarah for, certainly Islam is not Avodah Zarah for anybody, and Christianity is not Avodah Zarah for those who practice it. He says, "Eneni yodea ima she'ela sharishayon legoyim bilti notrim or bilti muslimim lavo lityashev ba'aretz." He says, I don't know if the issue of non-Jews who are not Christian and are not Muslim who want to come live in the land, lefi midat chukei hagira bilvad, based on immigration law, ta'alel perak ba'atid karov. I don't know if that's going to be a big question, because in his time, the question, they were talking about Christianity and Islam. Hagoyim atarbutiyim she'efshar lachshov alehem b'kesher im zeh, says you could think, maybe if you're trying to think what would be halachically defined, even for those who practice it, might be halakhically defined as Avodah Zarah. Hey Mahodim, it would be Indian culture, so we're talking about Hinduism, Hasinim Japanim, the Chinese and the Japanese. And then he says, Ubenogei lahem adayin eneni barur, enenu barur li she'afilu eila enem ovdam b'chituf. And he says, to be honest, I don't know enough. And he says, Kilo lamadti kara'uya tetoteim v'darkei pulchan shalem. He says, I don't really know enough about those religions to know if they're not also just shituf and they're not considered Avodah Zarah for those who practice them. Now, again, this is not a shiur on the status of Hinduism or any other or any Eastern religion, but he says, he says, but even if we did find out that they actually have a status of full Avodah Zarah, mikol makom, even for themselves, mikol makom, אם גם הם יוכללו בשטח הדרישה לדמוקרטיות במדינה יהודית מצד האומות המאוחדות, if the UN required that they would also have to get rights, democratic rights, חושבני שלא יהיה קושי שאי אפשר להתגבר עליו מצד חוק תורתנו הקדושה בנסיבות ובמצב הנוכחי של עם ישראל. I'm sure we could find a way to do it within halakha, given the reality that we are living in. And then he says, so long as they don't do anything that's immoral, like a practice of a widow walking on the bier after when her husband dies and getting burned with him. But that's, obviously he's coming from a place of not knowing so much about their cultures and saying, well, we would just have to make sure that it's not anything that could be, violent, dangerous to its own practitioners, right? So it's really interesting. Essentially, what I would say is, yes, it's true. I said that it's very easy to solve the problem, just show that people are not of the Avodah Zarah. There's also lurking in the background the question of whether you actually have to be you have to be considered a ger toshav, right? You have to be considered like b'nei Noach in order to be able to not have lo tichonim apply to you. Now, clearly, that's not where Rav Herzog is going here. It seems to be clear to him that Notrim and Muslimim are not of the Avodah Zarah. But I will say, it's interesting to suggest that he's basically saying that whole conversation is irrelevant because Lo Tichonim just doesn't apply when you are not in charge ultimately of the conditions by which you get your state. Now, that to me sounds incredibly reluctant. I want to move to Rav Chaim David Halevi, who is very much not reluctant. He is in the opposite way. And sometimes you can read some of the later perspectives on these issues as responses to Rav Herzog in a certain way. So this is from Rav Chaim David Halevi in 1987. He gave a presentation on Darchei Shalom, biyachasim sheben Yehudim l'shenam Yehudim. The whole concept of doing things for the ways of peace, right? We have a number of statements within rabbinic literature that we do certain things mipnei darchei shalom. And one of the things we do mipnei darchei shalom is we bury their dead, we visit their sick, arga b'eit tzedakah, make sure that they give tzedakah to them. Now, who's the them? Ovdei Avodah Zarah, pagans, right? Why mipnei darchei shalom? Now, the relationship between mipnei darchei shalom, doing things for the purpose of keeping the peace, and mishum eva, doing things so that people will not hate you. That's a very interesting and storied relationship. Are they actually the same? Are they different? Some people think that in the Rambam they're different, and Mivnei Darchei Shalom is more capacious, sort of Darchei Noam, B'chol Netivot Shalom. According to the Ramban, maybe they're actually the same thing, two sides of the same coin. But suffice it to say, what Rav Chaim David Halevi is going to do here is he's basically going to say, I don't think that the category of Darchei Shalom is the way we should be thinking about our relationship with minorities in Israel. Take a look. בבואנו להציג את הדרך שבה ניתן להשתמש הלכה למעשה במושג דרכי שלום לצורך פסיקת הלכה בימינו, when we come to present how we're supposed to use the concept of for the sake of the ways of peace as we rule in our day, halachically, ברור כבר שבהשקפה ראשונה שדרכי שלום שנזכרו בהלכה רובם המכריע הם ביחס לגויים אשר בקרבם חיינו בגלות. It says, first of all, it's very clear that the majority of cases where Darchei Shalom is mentioned is where we're living in the exile among non-Jews. Or perhaps for non-Jews who lived in our land in certain times. Me'ata, he says, from now, כיצד עלינו להתייחס במציאות חיינו במדינת ישראל להלכות ולעקרונות שנקבעו לכתחילה מפני דרכי שלום בלבד. He says, but now that we have our state, how are we supposed to relate to this concept of mipnei darchei shalom, things that were required only because of darchei shalom, like supporting the poor of the pagans, like burying the dead of the pagans, etc. כאשר במגילת עצמאותה נאמר במפורש, when the Megillat Atzmaut of Israel says explicitly, תקיים שוויון זכויות חברתי ומדיני גמור לכל אזרחיה בלי הבדל דת וגזע ומין. When actually our Megillat Atzmaut says that there is going to be full equal rights socially and state-wise for all of the citizens of Israel without distinction based on religion or race or gender. And here we see that the society in Israel is obligated to all of its citizens, gam goyim, including non-Jews, all of the same rights that are given, that are enshrined in law for Jews. We shouldn't be using the concept of mibnei darchei shalom to explain why why non-Jews have zchuyot. Non-Jews have zchuyot not because we're trying to keep the peace, but because they are citizens of the land. And he speaks specifically because it's a democracy. And he speaks specifically within this article about, or within this hartza'ah, within this lecture, about mechirat batim la'akum, selling houses to pagans. He says, Kazot hochachti b'sifri aseh lechara chelak chet siman samechet. He says, I already proved in my book of Shutim, in my book of Responsa, Aseh lecharav, which you can find on Bar Ilan Responsa if you're looking for it. Midivrei HaMeiri, based on the Meiri, Bidin Mechirat Batim La'akum, speaking of, regarding the law of selling houses to pagans. Shekatav, he wrote, the Meiri wrote, V'zol Shono, here's his language, Ulinyan Psak, when it comes to the rule, meaning the ruling, Davar Ze Lo Ne'emar Ela Ba'aretz Uvizmanim Sheizkarnu. This Lo Techonim is only talking about in Eretz Yisrael. It's only talking about in those times. It's talking about non-Jews who were in their time who actually truly worshipped idols, right? V'kavanato, and then says Rav Chaim David Halevi, v'kavanato le'ele she'adayin avdu avodah zarah mamash p'silei eitz ve'evan. He's talking about people who actually worshipped wooden and stone idols. Umikan she'et Islam b'chenet hanatzrut lo ra'a Avodah Zara klal v'ikar. The Meiri didn't see Islam certainly, and also Christianity as Avodah Zara at all. V'ayin od sham she'arachti. And look over there that I continue and give you a little bit that I give more expansion on this. Now, I think what's interesting here is that um, there it's possible that using the Meiri, he's actually not talking about just, well, technically speaking, Natsrut is Christianity is only Shituf for them. And it's while it's Avodah Zarah for us, it sounds like that the Meiri is much more expansive. And the Meiri is basically saying this whole concept of Lo Techonim, it just doesn't apply to nations that are not literally worshiping idols, right? So it's actually more expansive. And then Rav Chaim David Halevi basically says, I want to actually rename the way that we're supposed to engage with minorities in the land of Israel, non-Jewish minorities. And he says, Sikum, here's my summary, Yachasim Enoshiyim, v'lo mishum darchei shalom dafka. Should be, we have human relationships, and it's not based on darchei shalom per se, right? Atana shulu sikum el nekudat pticha. He says, I'm going to come back to summarize my opening point. Because the non-Jewish nations today do not have the status of pagans, even if the Jewish people did have yad tkefa, even if we were in charge, right? You can hear almost a response to Herzog a little bit. Even if we were in charge, lo ayinu chayavim b'shum panim linhog begoyei zmanenu kedin of Avodah Zarah. We would not have to act towards non-Jews in our time like pagan worshippers. Therefore, in any relationship between the Jewish people and non-Jews, hein ba'aretz ve'hin b'chul, whether we're talking about in the land of Israel or we're talking about in the outside the land of Israel, hein b'yachas ha'chevra k'medina le'ezracha ha'goyim, whether we're talking about a society vis-a-vis its non-Jewish residents, its non-Jewish citizens, uvein b'yachas ha'yachid l'shcheno o chavero hagoy, or a Jew and their non-Jewish neighbor. We should not be thinking about these relationships as solely in order to keep the peace. Rather, it should be based on the legal definition. They are not idol worshippers anymore. They are not idol worshippers anymore. Therefore, parnasatam, making sure that they are also taken care of if tzedakah is needed. Bikurei choleihem, visiting their sick. Kvurat miteihem, burying their dead. Bichum aveileihem, consoling their mourners. Ve'od, etc. Hakol nitan lahasot mitoch chova enoshit musarit. It should all be done from a basic moral human responsibility. Velo mishum darchei shalom dafka, and not specifically because of darchei shalom. Right? So, whereas what Herzog was leaning on, Rav Herzog was leaning on the idea that ein yadeinu tkefa, we are not actually in charge, we don't make our own decisions, and this is a t'nai, this is a condition for being able to get Medinat Yisrael. Rav Chaim David Halevi is going in the opposite direction and essentially saying, no, these definitions don't apply anymore. They really don't apply anymore, and we should actually be just thinking about, basic moral human relationships. Okay. The third approach that I want to offer here is Rav Yehuda Amital's approach in a piece in 1985, which also started as a lecture, as a talk. And he's like some interesting shiluv. He's like some interesting combination of a little bit from Rav Herzog, a little bit from Rav Chaim David Halevi, not in the sense of Rav Herzog's reluctance at all, but just in the sense of like mediniyut, sort of state politics. But let's see what he says. It says, Noseh hartzaati hu hayachas lemiyutim al pi Torah b'medinat Yisrael shelanu. And by the way, it's going to be interesting. He doesn't mention lo techonim. He doesn't talk about it at all. This is like a meta halachic perspective that he's offering. The topic of my talk today is the relationship to minorities based on the Torah in our state of Israel. I am emphasizing these last words, meaning our state of Israel. Mishum she'al basis ha'isur shel chilul Hashem, ani miyaches chashivut u'mashmaut l'ma shenechtav b'inyan zeh b'megillat ha'atzmaut. It says, because on the basis of the prohibition of defaming God's name, I am going to give significance, grant significance to what is written about this, meaning what is written about minority rights in Megillat Ha'atzmaut, in Israel's Declaration of Independence. Why? He's going to give halakhic significance to what is promised in Megillat Ha'atzmaut, and he's going to explain why. Kulanu makirim et maaseh givonim metuar b'Sefer Yoshua Perek Tet. We all know the story of the Gibeonites in chapter 9 of Sefer Yoshua. In case we don't, he goes through it. Misupar sham shagivonim nahagu ba'arma. The Gibeonites, who were a tribe in Israel, they acted with cunning. They basically pretended that they weren't part of the Shiva Amamin. They pretended that they weren't actually indigenous to the land of Israel. They were actually coming from somewhere far. They dressed up, they disguised themselves, and they said to Yoshua, we know that you're going to destroy all the seven nations. Why don't you make a brit? Why don't you make a treaty with us, a peace treaty? And Yoshua indeed actually did make a treaty with them. They made peace, and even the princes of the congregation swore on this. And when the Jews found out, oh my gosh, these people were lying to us. They're not actually from a faraway place. They live close by, right among us. But still the Jewish people did not attack them. Why? Because the princes of the congregation had made an oath. Haramba mehilchot malachim perek vav halacha gimel lomar miparsha zo halacha ledorot. So the Rambam actually in the Laws of Kings basically takes from this situation a everlasting halakha. He says v'asur l'shaker b'vritam u'lechazev lahem achar sheishlimu v'kiblu sheva mitzvot. Right? It is prohibited to lie when making a treaty with those who want to make a treaty with you. Presumably, we're talking about, offering peace before you go to war with indigenous nations. It is usher to lie to them after they have made peace with you and after they have accepted the 7 mitzvot b'nei Noach. Now, after they've accepted the 7 mitzvot b'nei Noach is a very interesting clause. We're going to leave it for now. But al kach katav Radbaz, the Radbaz says about this, this is learned from the situation of the Gibeonites, because if you do lie, if you make a treaty and then you attack, that's a chilul Hashem. Haramam kava ifoshi na'agut Yisrael klapei hagivonim hofech liot norma hilchatit. The Rambam turned what the Jews did vis-a-vis the Gibeonites. Once we have said something, once we have made a promise, we are not allowed to go back on it. He turned it into a halachic norm. And then says Rav Amital, "Eneni makir avtacha mamlachit pumbit yoter me'asher Megillat Ha'atzmaut." I don't know any more clear public state promise than the Megillat Ha'atzmaut, Israel's Declaration of Independence. Aleh chatmu kol manigei hamedina uva uvtach muforashot shivyon zchuyot l'chol amiyutim. Right? It says it literally says right in there, it is signed by all of the leaders of the nation, and it says right in there has to be equal rights for all of the minorities. That is a public promise that the Jewish people are making, and therefore he thinks it is halachically binding. Now, he doesn't end there, because it's almost like he doesn't want to leave it as, okay, so if we hadn't written Megillat Ha'atzmaut, then we wouldn't have to do any of these things, right? So he adds, Yehudi al pi hashkavat yahadut ha'ne'emana. He says, do you want to know what the real way of treating a non-Jew is based on genuine Judaism? He says, Yachasenu l'vnei umot ha'olam mitbases al chamisha yesodot. Our relationship to non-Jews should be based on 5 foundations. And each foundation gets a few paragraphs. One is Tzelem Elokim, everyone is in the divine image of God. One is Hadvekut b'midotav shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu shu tov lakol, that we should be imitating God, just like God is good to all, we should be good to all. Deracha darchei noam b'chol netivot shalom, its ways are ways of pleasantness, and all its paths are peace. Yehudo universali shel Yisrael, the Jewish people actually has a universal mission in the world. We're not just ostriches. And Kiddush Hashem umiyat chilul Hashem. We should be sanctifying God's name, and we should keep from the defamation of God. So notice what Rav Amital did here. He gave halachic weight to Megillat Atzmaut. Why? Because transgressing Megillat Atzmaut, the promises of Megillat Atzmaut, would constitute a chilul Hashem. So here we have three different bases. One is this is a condition in order for us to get the land, and therefore we don't actually have the upper hand. Another is, right, a non-idealistic version. Another is an idealistic version of this whole category doesn't apply anymore. It only applied to true idolaters who worship stone and wood, because the worry is that we would come to worship, God forbid, stone and wood. And the third, you have to do what you say. You have to avoid chilul Hashem and all of these other things, right? Make sure that you recognize the person's divine image. Make sure that you act like God. Make sure that the ways of Torah are peace. Make sure that you have a universal mission. And again, make sure that you don't do chilul Hashem. So there are other explanations. I want to just end with, I specifically did not use the explanation that actually suggests that you can think about non-Jews today as B'nai Noach, as Ger Toshav. I'm actually only going as far as long as they're not Ovdei Avodah Zarah, you're in a different category. The reason why I'm not doing that is because once you call somebody a Ger Toshav, first of all, there are a lot of issues of can you even have a Ger Toshav today? What are the requirements in order to have an actual official halacha Ger Toshav today? But once you have somebody as a Ger Toshav, actually, there are a whole bunch of halachic ramifications that now apply to those people that I don't think we say apply. I mean, very clearly, we don't say apply to non-Jews in our day. But suffice to say, as you are learning Masechet Avodah Zarah, and you say to yourself, "Oh, well, how do these things jive with, democracy and human rights and minorities, and how do these things jive?" These are three examples of people who were trying to figure out how in the world these things could go together. Thanks so much, everybody. See you next time.